Good afternoon, and thank you. Welcome to our Vida Book Company. We're here today with Mark Whicker. Mark has been a journalist for almost 50 years, 34 years with the Orange County Register. He's also a member of the U.S. Basketball Writers Hall of Fame. In 2014, he won the Nat Fleischer Award for distinguished boxing coverage, two-time member of the Associated Press's Sports Editors Top 10 columnists. And if that's not enough, he's a playwright whose work has also been performed in Orange County. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
We're here today to talk about Up and In, the life of a Dodgers legend, Don Drysdale. I think that's the right subtitle. So one of the things that struck me about the book is that for folks under 40, Don Drysdale is really someone from another era. But why is it important to keep those names and faces alive today?
Well, I think he was a pretty pivotal figure in the Dodgers' kind of golden age in the 60s when they went to the World Series in 63 and 65 and 66. They won two of those. They tied for the National League pennant in 62. And, they only came here in 1958. So that was really where they got the franchise started and established the popularity of the franchise today. And I think he symbolized a different way of playing baseball that a lot of us remember and the younger ones probably don't really identify with. But, the game back then was pretty aggressive. It was, the guys weren't making much money. They were basically playing for their jobs year to year. And it was a lot harder game, a lot coarser and more aggressive game back then. And he was the symbol of pitching inside. If you hit a home run in one at bat, you might go down. The next at bat, you might get one upside the head from him. He wasn't the only one. There were a lot of pitchers like that. It was really the way the game was played. But because he was so big and so talented and had, he expressed his anger. He wasn't one of those people that had a filter. He went to the mound mad, and he left the mound mad, and he transmitted that. And the fact that he did all that, and he also won 209 games and a Cy Young Award and set a record for most consecutive scoreless innings, I think he's a big figure in Dodger history. And frankly, I was surprised that no one had written a biography of him because so many other baseball books have been written in the last few years. So it was fun to do that and fun to go back into the archives and find out exactly what he did.
And especially with the streak, which we'll get to later, it makes them a part of all of baseball history.
Right. That was a record that has stood since Walker Johnson pitched. And, it was 58 and 2/3 innings. And he pitched 9 innings every time. And, it wasn't an unearned run streak. It was a run streak. So if somebody made an error or if he had a wild pitch, that would have snapped the streak too. So it was probably the accomplishment that got him into the Hall of Fame. It happened near the end of his career.
Right.
It really gave him an identity apart from what he had already carved out. A lot of people looked at him as the second fiddle to Sandy Koufax because Sandy had those phenomenal years in the mid-'60s. But Drysdale was there before Koufax, and he pitched after Koufax left. And I think the people on the team back then looked at him as a real leader at the team. And back then, they had a lot of marquee players. But he was the guy that it all kind of revolved around.
Right. So unlike a chronology where you start with birth and work your way forward, the first couple of chapters of your book really introduce us to a player that was larger than life. In your research, did you find anything that surprised you?
Yeah, I think, we look at him as this big macho guy who, went out with the boys every night and had a few pops and ran the streets and then played very aggressively, pitched very aggressively. And he did all that. But at home, he was very fastidious. He was the first guy to clean out the ashtrays if you put a cigarette in the ashtray. He was a kind of a neat freak. And the houses that he built, one with his former wife and then one with Ann Myers, who's his second wife, he was extremely engaged in designing the houses and putting the houses together and the landscaping and furniture and art and all those things. He had those. I think his mother was like that, and he kind of carried that around. He loved flowers. He always had flowers around. And I think Bob Euchre, who was a good friend of his, was talking about how, Don was in the kitchen, big 6'6" guy wearing an apron one day, and how incongruous that was. So there was that side of him too, and that was probably the only thing that really surprised me. I think a lot of people probably don't know that he was extremely aware of what his teammates were going through, especially the young ones. He took a lot of young teammates under his wing and took care of them when they came to the Dodgers. He was very aware of what was going on around him. I think the expression you hear these days is he was a good teammate, and I think everybody would realize that if he knew him, that it was a good teammate.
Right. And for those of us who remember, he was an incredibly fierce competitor, but you also write about what a generous man he was.
Yeah, the difference between him and Bob Gibson, there was another guy who liked to knock people down, is that, when the game was over, Don was, he'd go out to dinner and socialize with the people, even on the other team. Gibson had his game face on all the time. In fact, when he went to the All-Star game, he didn't even talk to the National League teammates because he knew he was going to have to get them out in a couple of weeks when he went back to pitching in. So, Don was very generous, and like I said, he took care of people. He was aware of what people needed, and he was very team oriented that way.
Yeah. It's just interesting because you don't always associate those characteristics with someone that is so big and looks so fierce coming at you from the mind. Yeah. And, back in those days, when pitchers would throw at hitters, the policing was done by the teams.
Right.
Yeah. For those that are under 40 or 40 around, tell us how today's game has changed all of that.
Well, it just isn't a part of the game anymore. I mean, when somebody hits a home run, the next guy up doesn't get knocked down. That happened very often back then. And, rookies even went through it. Joe Torre talked about, when he made his circuit around the league the first time he went around the league, he got knocked down because pitchers wanted to see how he would handle it. And nowadays, that's not part of the game. Umpires, if you come inside and hit somebody, the umpires give a warning to both benches that if there's any retaliation, the pitcher will get thrown out of the game, and sometimes even the manager. And so there really isn't a pressure release, for those things to happen. And pitchers nowadays, they throw harder than they used to, but they also don't have the command. So some guys throw at people just because they aren't meaning to, but you're throwing 99 miles an hour, and sometimes it goes off by itself and goes in somebody's head. And hitters aren't used to that. They didn't grow up that way, so they're more likely to charge the mound, and you have these dugouts emptying and everything, and a brouhaha going on, which you didn't really have back then. I mean, it's the Dodgers' philosophy is if you hit one of our guys, we're going to hit two of your guys.
Right.
And the players did take care of it, and I think a lot of times they expected to get hit, and then you move on. But nowadays, it isn't that way. And it's funny, Drysdale, for as many batters that he hit, as often as he pitched inside, he only had one real brawl, and that was with Johnny Logan of the Milwaukee Braves back when they were in Brooklyn before they even moved out here.
Right.
And, Don was young then and more temperamental than he was later, and they got into a kind of a war of words, and that became this epic brawl with Eddie Matthews and a lot of other players getting involved. But really, I think Jeff Torborg said, Don would throw at you, and if he knocked you down, he would stand in front of the mound and look at you like, what are you going to do about it? And that was that. Nobody came out after him. So he was 6'5" in an era when pitchers weren't all 6'5" like they are today. And so he was intimidating from that sense. But it's totally different now, and I think most managers and umpires wish it would go back to the way it was.
Sometimes I miss those old days.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, the managers don't argue with the umpires anymore because you've got, replays and challenges and all that.
It's a more benign.
Yeah, it certainly is.
So one of the things that was really interesting to me in your book is Drysdale graduated from high school in 54, played for the Bakersfield minor league team, moved up the next year to Montreal, which is the Dodger, I believe, AAA
Yeah.
team. And then in his third year, moved up to the big team in 56.
Mhm.
But what I didn't realize was that when he was at Montreal, Tommy Lasorda was a huge help to him.
Yeah.
I didn't realize Tommy Lasorda had also won so many games in the minor leagues.
Mhm.
But one of the things you write is that Lasorda showed Drysdale how to take the game seriously and, if necessary, personally.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, Tommy was part of that Dodger tradition of throwing inside, and it predated Tommy. It went back a long way. And Tommy was, remembering him as a manager, it wouldn't be a surprise to know that he was that type of competitor as well. And he would throw at you. And Don, who really came to pitching relatively late in life. I mean, he wasn't a guy who grew up pitching from the age of 8. He picked it up later, and so it was kind of a clean slate with him. And he learned from him. He learned from Tommy. He learned from Sal Magley, who the Dodgers got later from the Giants, and he learned from some other guys that you had to pitch inside, and if necessary, you had to hit somebody. And Tommy won a lot of games in AAA. He was a great AAA pitcher. I don't think he ever forgave the Dodgers for sending him down so they could bring up Sandy Koufax. I think he took that personally. But Tommy was a Dodger through and through, as we all know, and he was one of the many people that kind of took Don under his wing, along with Gil Hodges and some other old Dodgers. So yeah, Tommy was an important guy for them. And when Don came back and was the broadcaster for the Dodgers, he and Tommy sort of took Oral Hershiser under their wing. And Oral said that his education in the game and the mentality to go 9 innings and to pitch inside when you have to, he picked that up from Don and Tommy. So it's kind of a thing that went generation to generation.
And the differences in the game, I know, I think there was a game in 1959, so it would have been the Coliseum. The game went 13 innings. Drysdale pitched the whole game, and I think it was like 176 pitches.
Mm-hmm.
Are we just so far past that we're never going to see that type of durability again?
Yeah, I don't know if there's ever going to be a 300-game winner again, because those are the guys that pitched. I mean, there are not going to be a lot of 200-game winners, really.
Yeah.
Back then, a lot of pitchers would go. The hardest working pitchers would pitch, 275 to 300 innings. There's only been one guy in baseball who's pitched 200 innings each of the last 2 years, and that's Logan Webb of San Francisco. So it's, you expect to go through 5 or 6 and you get to 90 pitches or 100 pitches and they take you out. Well, back then they didn't really count pitches all the time. That just wasn't done. But they developed relievers for specialty roles, left-handers to get left-handers out, set up guys, guys who come in with men on base, and then closers. Back then, if you were in the bullpen, generally it meant you weren't good enough to be a starter. That's where they put the guys who couldn't start. So Don, and on top of that, there was no designated hitter, and Don was an excellent hitter. One year he had the best batting average on the team, and I think I didn't do the research on this, but it would be interesting. I think he probably pinch hit more often than he was pinch hit for. He pinch hit for other guys, and there were games during the streak in which it's 1-0 in the 8th inning. There's no way a starter would be in the game today at that time, and he was out running the bases and hitting doubles and sliding in the home plate, and it is a totally different game from that standpoint. So the mentality was to go 9 innings. You pitch, and then the catcher hands you the ball after 9 innings, and you did your job. And I think it was very appropriate that for the streak, all those games were 9-inning complete games until the streak ended.
Right. And I think it was 6 complete, and then plus the
part of
the game got hit. Yeah. So in your book, you chronicle the years 1959 to 66 really, really well, I thought. And in that span, the Dodgers went to 4 World Series. They won 3 of them. Can you put your finger on what made the Dodgers so great in that span of years?
Well, I think pitching had a great deal to do with it. When they moved out here, they still had a lot of the old Dodgers. They had Gil Hodges, Dick Snyder, Charlie Neal, and Carl Erskine, and guys like that. And that era was sort of fading, fading into retirement age. That a lot of those guys still helped them win in '59 when they beat the White Sox. So they had to transition, and they had a lot of young players come up. The Coliseum was an odd place to play baseball. It had a 250-foot fence in left field. They had a left-handed hitter named Wally Moon, who mastered the art of hitting fly balls that would be normally routine fly balls, and they would go over the fence. They used to call those moon shots. But it was just a very bizarre place to play. When they moved to Dodger Stadium in 1962, it was a big ballpark. It was hard for anybody to hit there. And so they developed, they had a lot of speed on their team. Maury Wills had been playing in the minor leagues for years. The Dodgers brought him up, and he set stolen base records. Willie Davis was very fast. They didn't have a lot of power. They didn't score a lot of runs, but they executed so well. They were so good defensively, and their pitching was so good that they were able to prosper in an era when almost every other team in the National League was a good hitting team. When you look at the players who played back in those days, Roberto Clemente and Frank Robinson and Vada Pinson and on and on and on. Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Eddie Matthews. I mean, it was really a golden age of offensive baseball in the National League. And the Dodgers, they were able to out-execute those teams and win. And, a typical rally would be, Maury Wills would walk and then he would steal second, and Junior Gilliam would hit a ground ball to second base. Wills would go to third, and then he'd score on a fly ball.
Right.
Sometimes that's all the runs that you needed. There was one instance where they sent Drysdale ahead of the team to St. Louis because he wasn't pitching in the third game of the series. And so he got up the next morning in the hotel and went down to breakfast, and somebody said, "Hey, did you hear Sandy Koufax pitched a no-hitter yesterday?" And Don said, "Did he win?" And he wasn't really joking at that time either. But that's something the pitchers just lived with, and it was a classic example of a franchise kind of going against the grain,
Right.
To win, and that's what the Dodgers did, and they had an identity because of that.
So, what some of the folks that will read your book will know the Dodgers as a Los Angeles team. We all know that where they came from in Brooklyn, and there have been books written about that. But one of the things that you talk about are the big differences between what life was like in Brooklyn and what it was like in Los Angeles, and how that impacted the team. Tell us about those differences.
Well, Brooklyn was like a small town in a big city, and neighborhood. They all lived roughly in the same neighborhood. They all went to the same restaurants. They used the same dry cleaners. They probably went to the same hardware stores. They just had a little culture there, and people on the street knew them. They were just part of the atmosphere. Ebbets Field was right there in the middle of Brooklyn, and so they really enjoyed it. In fact, Don said that even though Don was from Van Nuys, you would have thought he would have been eager to move back here. He said that if the Dodger players had had a vote, they would have voted 25-0 to stay in Brooklyn.
Wow.
But when they came to Los Angeles, everybody who's ever come to Los Angeles knows this, it's totally confusing when you get here. It's so big. You don't know where these roads are going. You don't know, where all these cars came from. And the team, they had to figure out where to live, what schools to put their kids in. Oftentimes they were living, 40 to 45 minutes or an hour from the ballpark. And so I think a lot of that kind of contributed to the fact that they weren't very good in 1958. They finished next to last in the league. But eventually the showbiz community embraced the Dodgers so much, and the people came out in such record numbers that eventually they all kind of felt at home. And then you had a new generation of players who hadn't played in Brooklyn, and that's all they do. But yeah, it was a totally different atmosphere. Don, several years later, he visited Brooklyn and pulled up across the street from a restaurant that he and the rest of the guys would go to 15, 20 years before that. And he got out of the car, and somebody was in front of the restaurant and said, "Hey, Drysdale, what are you doing here?" I mean, it's like he'd never left. And so he missed that, and I remember when the Dodgers would go to Shea Stadium in the late '80s and early '90s, there would always be a couple of old guys at the stadium who would talk to Vin Scully and say, "Hey, Vinny, when do you think the team's coming back?" And and Vin would have to explain, "No, I don't think we're going back. We draw 3.5 million fans in LA. I don't think I'm going back." So, but yeah, it was a special place, and it's kind of I wish I covered baseball back then. It would have been a lot of fun.
Yeah, very, very special place. So in 1966, Koufax retires at the end of the season. In 1968, I believe they were still on Vero Beach. Drysdale arrives and realizes he's the last standing Brooklyn Dodger.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has a very good year, including the streak breaking Walter Johnson's record by pitching 58 and 2/3 scoreless innings. Jump forward 20 years, and Orel Hershiser breaks the record by about an inning. I think you mentioned that someone wanted him to stop at 58, so it could be a co-record.
Right.
But I was surprised to learn about the relationship between Drysdale and Hershiser.
Yeah, Drysdale was a broadcaster then, and like I said, he had sort of been somewhat of a mentor to Orel. Fernando Valenzuela had been the ace of the staff before that, and Orel had come up through the system. Orel was not intimidating to look at like Drysdale was. He was kind of a,
he's still not intimidating.
Not really. He's gained a little weight, but he was a real, he was kind of a tall, scrawny looking guy. He wore glasses. He was a devout Christian. He didn't go out and raise hell with the guys like they used to do in Drysdale's day. But he and Don were close, and Don there's never an instance that you can find of Don, being upset that his record was going to be broken. He never really bothered himself with things like that. And he was rooting for Orel, and he was in the dugout when Orel did break the record that night in San Diego because he was on the radio. He was going to interview Orel. And he said that, Don was number 53 and Orel was number 55 throughout their career. And he said that he felt a lot of kinship with Orel because when the clubhouse guy gives you that number when you're young, what he's saying is if you get a number that high, he's saying, the clubhouse guy is saying, I don't think you're going to be around, and Don and Orel Don felt like Orel and he had something in common that way.
That's great. So in 1969, Drysdale retires.
Mm-hmm.
He also sadly goes through a divorce from his wife, Ginger, married 11 years. But I thought a neat part about the book was the time that you spent talking about how he changed and who he became after marrying Ann Myers.
Yeah, that's really the most interesting part of the book for me. Ann Myers was a Hall of Famer in her own right. It's the only Hall of Fame couple, in sports who got married. And Ann was a pioneering basketball player at UCLA, and she almost made the Indiana Pacers roster one year. She was in the final cut to actually play in the NBA. And she was a tremendous athlete. She grew up in a huge family, and they kept up with all kinds of sports, but they weren't baseball fans. And Ann was 19 years younger than Don. And Ann said, I didn't know who he was. She said, I might have had his baseball card, but the only use I had for baseball cards was to put them in the spokes of my bicycle.
There you go.
So she might have had Don's card in the bicycle and not known it. But she was competing in the Superstars competition that ABC used to have, where they would get all these athletes and they would track and field and swimming and obstacle courses and things like that. And Ann was involved in that. And her and her mother were in Florida when they did that. Don was there doing TV for ABC, along with Bob Uecker and others. And when Ann's mom knew who Don was, but when Ann was introduced to Don, she didn't know who he was. And I don't know if Don felt that was intriguing or not, but they had dinner a couple of nights later, and Don was very decisive in things that he would do. He didn't hesitate about things. And he said, when dinner was over, he said, well, what do you think? Maybe what do you think about getting married? And Ann was totally flabbergasted and said, well, for one thing, you're married. That hadn't come through yet. And the divorce hadn't come through yet. And but Ann admitted that she was pretty smitten with him, and the fact that he had an interest in her. And she always talked about how comfortable he was in any setting. He could relate to anybody and was never flustered or anything. And so they would call each other and on and sort of built a relationship that way. And eventually they did get married, and it was, I don't think anybody would tell you that it wasn't the happiest time of his life. They were really the same person. They were super competitive. Don one time said, I have to cheat to beat her at golf, and she can beat me in tennis. And Sonny Jurgensen, the quarterback,
Redskins,
he said, that's kind of like grounds for divorce as far as I'm concerned. But they were very they understood what it was like to compete at that level. Like, if you're at that level, there aren't a lot of people you can relate to that way. And so Don got his act together. He cut down on a lot of his lifestyle things, but he was he enjoyed just being home. And then they had 3 kids. They were 1, 3, and 5 when Don passed away, and they too had to go through life in a very strange way, because when they would introduce themselves, they were usually introducing themselves to people who knew all about Don,
right?
And they didn't know anything about Don. They were never, except for the oldest one, had some memories of him, but. So it's just a very interesting life, and it's tragic, and even to this day, he was only 56,
Right.
And they would be very happily married to this day, I'm convinced. And but I thought that whole dynamic was the most interesting part of the book, and the thing that I was struck with is that how popular and how happy people were that they did get together, because everybody loves Ann. I mean, Ann's got 1 million friends in sports, and Don too. And people were just ecstatic that they found each other and had that type of relationship.
Well, yeah, it was my favorite part of the book too, because it was a little peek into the side you really never saw if you were just a fan like I was.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just about done. This one is going to wrap it up, but I was looking at the sources that you use, and I was just it's a baseball fan's dream to talk to the people that you talk to.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy Koufax, Wes Parker, Joe Torre, Vin Scully, Ross Porter,
Mm-hmm.
Frank Howard, 6'7" Frank Howard, Tim McCarver.
Yeah.
Was there a recurring theme in all of those conversations that you had? Like, what stood out to you when you think about all of those folks that you spoke with?
Well, they all had a story about him. I mean, there was never anybody that said, I didn't really know him that well or anything. He was just so well known to a lot of people. And the phrase that kept coming out, and, I didn't really know how to interpret it, but, several people said, he was a man's man, And I don't know, I mean, you can misinterpret that, or it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and I'm not sure what it meant, but I think it was because people, like Ann Myers said, that people just felt comfortable around him, and he protected a lot of people, but he was just a very companionable person. He had friends not only in baseball but in show. Frank Sinatra was a good friend of his,
Right.
And I just think that theme. The respect that they had for him, and the fact that he sort of symbolized not only the Dodgers, but the way the game was played back then. And really, I think he symbolized Los Angeles in a lot of ways, because the 60s were pretty turbulent in Los Angeles. And that was kind of the decade where LA became more of an international city, and in the 50s and 60s, it just grew so much, and more things came there. I remember I grew up in North Carolina, and I know a lot of people, you looked at California as this paradise, like, wow, what's it like to be there, and wonder, and then you would see people like Don and other people who were, had surfed and had been in the sun and everything, and they looked like gods, like, wow, what a place that must be. And that's why a lot of people moved out here. I would have loved to have lived out here in the 50s. It must have been a lot of fun, certainly a lot less traffic and a lot more orange trees. But I just think Don, he symbolized those eras. And I was fortunate enough to know him a little bit when he was a broadcaster. And he was always glad to see you, and you were always glad to see him. And that's probably the biggest compliment you could give somebody.
Well, this has been a real treat and a real pleasure. The book is up and in, The Life of a Dodgers Legend. Is that right?
Yeah.
And we really appreciate your time today. And our Vital Book Company appreciates your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wait.